Picture this. It's early on March 24, 2026. The sun is barely up over Miami Gardens. Inside a conference room at Hard Rock Stadium, a group of WTA executives are sitting around a table, coffee going cold, faces tight. They weren't there to celebrate. They were there because something had gone very, very wrong. The 2026 Miami Open was supposed to be historic, record-breaking, the most profitable tournament the organization had ever run. And on paper, every sign pointed that way. Ticket sales had exploded in the weeks leading up to the event, up 48% from the previous year. Merchandise lines were selling out. Broadcast deals were signed at premium rates. Filipino fans had flown in from across the world, booked hotels, bought flights, packed stadiums. The energy around this tournament was unlike anything the WTA had seen in years. And it was built almost entirely around one person. A 20-year-old from the Philippines named Alex, who had turned the tennis world upside down just by showing up and playing her game. Her name alone was moving merchandise at 57% of total sales.
Let that sink in. One player.
More than every other athlete in the draw combined. The tournament had projected $47.2 million in total revenue. What they actually collected was $42.5 million. That's a $4.7 million gap. And instead of sitting quietly with that number and figuring out what actually went wrong, the WTA did something that nobody saw coming. They started pointing fingers. And the finger they pointed landed squarely on Alex. Here's where the story really begins, because what happened next wasn't just a financial dispute or an internal business disagreement. It became one of the most talked about controversies in women's tennis in years, and it revealed something uncomfortable about the way sports organizations treat the very athletes they profit from. So let's go back to the beginning and walk through exactly how this all unraveled. When the tournament was being planned, the WTA leaned hard into Alex's popularity. That decision made sense on the surface. She had been drawing enormous crowds. She had the kind of magnetism that doesn't come along very often in sports. Wherever she competed, fans showed up in force, wearing her colors, carrying flags, chanting her name. The Filipino community around the world had rallied behind her in a way that felt genuinely historic. You could feel it at the stadiums. You could feel it online. She had become something bigger than just a tennis player. She was a symbol of something. And the WTA, to their credit, recognized that early. They built marketing campaigns around her. They negotiated broadcast deals on the expectation that she would go deep into the draw. Sponsors paid premium rates for courtside visibility during her matches. Broadcast networks signed on for primetime slots tied to her schedule. The whole financial architecture of the tournament had Alex at the center of it. And when she lost in the fourth round to Karolina Muchova, the 13th seed and reigning Qatar Open champion, that architecture started to crack. Now let's be clear about something. Alex losing in the fourth round of a Grand Slam level event is not a catastrophe. She's 20 years old. She's still developing. Fourth round exits happen to everyone, including the greatest players who ever lived. She had played a grueling 3-hour match against Laura Siegemund in an earlier round, dealing with delays, with gamesmanship, with the mental grind of staying present through all of it. She came back from that and competed against Muchova until the very last point. That's not failure. That's a young player learning what it takes to win at the highest level. But for the WTA's financial model, the fourth round was a problem. The premium ticket sessions for the quarterfinals, the semifinals, the final had all been marketed with the implication that Alex would be there. When she wasn't, the secondary market for those tickets dropped. Sponsors who had paid for visibility during her matches got far fewer hours than they'd anticipated. Broadcast partners found themselves with empty time slots where her matches were supposed to be. And several major sponsors had actually taken out key player performance insurance policies, betting that her popularity would carry them through at least the semifinals. When she exited in the fourth round, those policies triggered payouts that hit the tournament directly. Add in the secondary market collapse, the reduced broadcast hours, and the sponsor compensation demands, and suddenly that $4.7 million gap starts to have a shape. But here's the thing that the WTA's internal memo conveniently left out. A lot of that damage had nothing to do with Alex. Let's talk about the weather, because what happened during the first week of the 2026 Miami Open was genuinely chaotic. On March 15th, the tournament experienced a complete washout. Every qualifying match, every practice session, all of it wiped out by weather.
Then on March 18th, it got worse. A full tournament shut down.
37 scheduled matches across both the ATP and WTA draws were cancelled outright. Players like Venus Williams, Matteo Berrettini, Stefanos Tsitsipas, and Gregor Dimitrov were left sitting in locker rooms for hours before the day was officially abandoned. That kind of disruption doesn't just hurt the schedule. It hits revenue directly.
Concession sales gone.
Merchandise opportunities lost. Ticket refunds issued. The estimated financial impact of those 2 weather days alone was over $2 million. The tournament's insurance covered some of it, but not all of it. That's $2 million with zero connection to anything Alex did or didn't do. Then there's the sponsorship math, which gets even more revealing the closer you look at it. The key player performance insurance policies that triggered payouts after Alex's 4th-round exit had been written based on her ranking at the time the contracts were signed. At that point, she was sitting at number 29 in the world. But rankings in tennis are a living thing. They move constantly based on points expiring, points being earned, tournaments being played. By the time the Miami Open actually started, Alex's ranking had dropped to number 51 in the live standings because her semi-final points from the previous year's Miami had expired. The sponsors had essentially been working off a projection that was already outdated before the tournament even began. That's not Alex's fault. That's a contract negotiation failure. And the broadcast partners, they had signed on for primetime coverage assuming she would reach at least the quarterfinals. When she didn't, they faced a 23% shortfall in the viewership hours they had been promised. They wanted compensation. The WTA had to find that money somewhere. So when you add it all up, the $4.7 million shortfall is really a collection of separate failures. Weather damage that nobody could have predicted. Sponsorship deals written on outdated rankings. Broadcast commitments that assumed one specific outcome from one specific player. None of that is the result of Alex losing a tennis match. It's the result of an organization that built a financial model with no safety net, no diversification, no contingency planning. A model that assumed perfection from a 20-year-old who was never guaranteed to deliver it. But that's not what the WTA's internal memo said. The memo, which was marked confidential and was circulated among executive leadership before somehow finding its way into the public domain, was scathing. It talked about over-reliance on a single player's marketability creating an unsustainable revenue model. It described Alex's inability to convert popularity into consistent deep tournament runs as a systemic risk to WTA events. It suggested that going forward, tournament planning had to account for the volatility of a player who, and this is the part that really stung, had yet to prove she could sustain the level required to meet financial projections. Read that again. The WTA's internal document described a 20-year-old athlete who had outsold every other player in the field as a volatility risk.
Not the rain.
Not the outdated sponsorship contracts. Not the lack of financial contingency planning.
Alex.
The reaction when that memo leaked was immediate and it was fierce. Filipino fans who had spent enormous amounts of money traveling to Miami, booking hotels, buying tickets, supporting the tournament in every way they could, felt personally betrayed. Social media became a wall of anger and disbelief. People were posting screenshots of the memo alongside photos of packed stadiums and sold-out merchandise stands, asking the same question over and over. How do you blame the person who sold out your tournament for not selling out your tournament hard enough? The sentiment across the tennis community was the same. Analysts pointed out that $42.5 million is not a failure by any reasonable standard. It's an enormous amount of money for a tennis tournament. The issue was the gap between projection and reality, and that gap existed because the projections themselves were reckless. You don't build a $47 million revenue model on the back of one player, one sports economist said plainly. That's not ISA's fault. That's basic business. Players started speaking out. At first anonymously, then on the record. Jessica Pegula, who had faced Alex in the Miami semifinals the previous year and knew exactly what her presence meant to a tournament, was measured but clear. She said Alex draws incredible crowds, handles herself with class, and the business side of things shouldn't be her responsibility. Coco Gauff, one of Alex's close friends and occasional doubles partner, was more direct. Alex is 20 years old, Gauff said. She's out there competing her heart out. If the tournament built its financial model around her and it didn't work out, that's not her problem. That's their problem. And then Billie Jean King spoke. The founder of the WTA, the person who built the organization from the ground up to give female athletes a platform and a voice, issued a statement. She said she created the WTA to give women a platform to shine, not to make them scapegoats for organizational failures. She called Alex the future of the sport. She said the organization should be celebrating her, not blaming her. When the founder of your organization publicly distances herself from the way you handled a situation, that's not a minor moment. That's a signal that something went seriously wrong. The WTA scrambled. They issued a follow-up statement saying the leaked memo was part of a broader financial review and was never intended to place blame on any individual player. They expressed regret for any misunderstanding. But here's the thing about damage control statements issued after a memo has already gone viral. They don't undo the memo. The tennis world had seen what the conversation looked like behind closed doors. It had seen the language executives used when they thought nobody was watching. And that trust, once broken, doesn't come back easily. Through all of it, Alex said nothing publicly. She had already left Miami by the time the memo broke. She was back home in the Philippines, away from the cameras and the chaos, taking a few days before turning her attention to the clay season. Her management team released a short statement saying she was focused on recovery and preparation and had no comment on matters outside her control. But people close to her described someone who was hurt. Not confused about whether the blame was fair, because she knew it wasn't. Hurt in a different, quieter way. She had given everything to that tournament. She had played through brutal conditions, through long matches, through the weight of an entire nation watching her every move. She walked off that court having competed as hard as she could, and then found out that the response from the organization was to put her name in a document about financial failures. She left Miami with 120 ranking points and $15,720 in prize money. Her ranking dropped to approximately 45th in the world, a slide but not a disaster. Not the catastrophe that the memo's language implied. And now the conversation about her future, about what her development means for women's tennis, had been filtered through the lens of someone who'd let a tournament down, rather than someone who was still becoming everything she was capable of being. What makes this story worth sitting with, beyond the politics and the financial arguments, is what it reveals about the relationship between sports organizations and the athletes who make those organizations valuable. The WTA didn't build its 2026 Miami revenue model on its own reputation. It built it on Alex's. It used her face, her story, her connection to a massive and passionate fanbase to sell tickets and sign sponsors and negotiate broadcast rights. And then, when the outcome of a tennis match didn't align with the projections on a spreadsheet, the organization turned around and called her a liability. That's the part that the tennis world found unacceptable. Not the financial disappointment. Businesses have bad quarters. Tournaments don't always hit their targets. That's understood. What wasn't acceptable was the instinct to reach for a scapegoat rather than a mirror. The Reign cancelled 37 matches. The contracts were written on outdated rankings. The model had no diversification and no contingency. Those are organizational failures. All of them. And a 20-year-old tennis player who outsold everyone else in the building shouldn't have to carry that.
The clay season is coming.
Alex will head to the Upper Austria Ladies Linz Open in early April, then Madrid for the first WTA 1000 event on clay, then Rome, and eventually Roland Garros. Clay is actually where Alex has spent a significant amount of her development time. She trained at the Rafa Nadal Academy, and that surface rewards exactly the kind of player she is. Patient, tactical, smart with angles, able to construct points.